individual social actor or at the level of the social aggregate, whichever is appropriate given the nature of the theory that is being tested. It is this emphasis on empirical observation and testing that produces the two characteristic features of the behavioral approach to social inquiry. The first and least continuous to these is behavioral commitment to the systematic use of all the relevant empirical evidence rather than a limited set of illustrative supporting examples. This commitment simply means that when a particular theoretical statement is being investigated, the researcher must not limit him in consideration of only those observed cases that provide anaconda support for the theoretical claim that are being made. Rather, the researcher must consider all the cases or at least a representative sample of them that are encompassed by a theoretical statement that is being evaluated. It is in this context that the use and development of statistical techniques is justified by behavioralists as a vehicle for analyzing large amount of relevant empirical evidence. It should be emphasized in the strongest possible terms, however, that behavioralism is not synonym either with qualification or with the downgrading of qualitative research. Certainly, behavior researchers have frequently used quantitative techniques as heuristic device for handling evidence. There is nothing intrinsic in behavioral epistemological position, however, that require quantification. On the contrary, quantitative and qualitative form of empirical analysis are equally acceptable to behavioral researcher. What matter for them is not whether evidence is qualitative or quantitative, but A, that is used to evaluate theoretical proposition, and B, that is employed systematically rather than illustratively. The second characteristics features on behavioral analysis is slightly more subtle in this implications, but no less important. It is simply that scientific theory and no explanation must be principle be capable of being falsified. Note, here the reference is to scientific rather than simply to empirical or explanatory theories. This usage reflects behavioralism commitment to Karl Popper's revision of traditional positivism, in which he A. substitute the principle of falsibility for that of verification, and B. simultaneously identified the falsibility criterion as the line of demarcation between scientific and scientific inquiry. Popper, 1959. In order fully to appreciate the import of this statement, a brief digression is necessary. We need to consider precisely what is meant by the theory or an explanation using falsifiable. Consider the familiar statement that Popper himself used as an example. All swans are white. Suppose that we observe a black swan. What does this tell us about the statement? One interpretation is that observing the black swan showed the statement to be empirically false. The statement was in principle capable of being falsified, and it has been falsified. But there is another way of interpreting the statement in the light of black swan being observed. The statement says that all swans are white. It follows that the black swan that we have observed cannot be a swan because it is not white. The statement therefore is not false. Can both of these interpretations be correct? The answer is that they can. Each interpretation makes a different set of assumptions about the definition of a swan. The first assumes that a swan is a large bird with a long neck that looks very pretty when it paddles through water. It says nothing of a bird color. In this circumstance, that definitions of swan and color are independent. There is no overlap between them. In other words, it is possible to observe something that has all the characteristics of a swan, regardless of its color. We have observed a black swan, and therefore the initial statement must have been false. The second interpretation assumes that a swan is a large bird with a long neck that looks very pretty when it paddles through water, and that is also white. In other words, this second interpretation assumes that whiteness is part of definition of being a swan. In these circumstances, when a black swan is observed, it cannot be a swan, because part of the definition of being a swan is that it is white. What is clear from this discussion is that the status of the statement depends upon whether or not its continued terms are independently defined. With the first interpretation, the terms swan and white are independently defined. As the result, the statement of an empirical or falsifiable one. It is possible to test it against the world of observation. With the second interpretation, however, the terms swan and white are not independently defined. As a result, the statement is partially tautological. It is simply an untestable assertion that one of the defining features of a swan is that it is white. This problem of interpretation is common in the social science. Consider the following statement. In general election, people vote against the incumbent government if they are dissatisfied with the performance. Without further information, we cannot tell whether this is a testable empirical statement or merely a definitional tautology. The statement can in fact be interpreted in two completely different ways. First, we can interpret the statement in purely tautological terms. Looking at the particular election, we could A. That every voter who voted for the government must have been satisfied with its performance, other he would not have voted for it. And B. That every voter who did not vote the government could not have been satisfied with the performance, otherwise she would have voted for it. With this interpretation, we always believe in the statement, but we have not demonstrated that it is empirically correct. We have treated it purely as a tautology. The second interpretation is to regard the statement as an empirical one, but this is possible only if we provide a definition of dissatisfaction with the government that is independent of the act of voting. If we were to devise some independent way of measuring dissatisfaction, then we would obviously be able to test our initial statement against any available empirical evidence. Crucially, however, by providing independent definition of voting and of dissatisfaction, we create the possibility that the statement might be empirically incorrect. We render the statement falsifiable, even though we might hope that it will not be falsified. Having distinguished between falsifiable and non-falsifiable statement, Popper goes on to suggest that theories can only be regarded as scientific if they generate empirical predictions that are capable of being falsified. Theories which do not generate such prediction are merely sophisticated tautology which explain nothing, no matter how elegant and elaborate they might appear. Many behavioralists are unconcerned as to whether or not their research should be described as scientists. Crucially, however, they are unequally committed to the principle of falsifiability. While behavioralists do not deny that there are other ways of evaluating the adequacy of a particular theory, they nonetheless insist that a genuinely explanatory theory, but ungender falsifiable proposition of the form if A and B, if not A then not B, and it must specify causal accidents that are defined independently on the phenomenon that is supposedly being explained. All this is not so suggest, however, that behavioralists believe that all aspects of their theories must be capable of being falsified. As Luckestor 1971 has argued, most theory in the physical and social sciences contain a non-falsible set of core propositions. These core propositions often take the form of highly abstract assumptions that are not susceptible to empirical testing. The non-falsibility of a core propositions, however, does not necessarily mean that the theory itself is non-falsible, provided that a series of testable predictions which can be examined in the light of empirical observation can be derived logically from the core, then the theory of the whole can be regarded as falsifiable. It does represent something more than sophisticated tautology. It does provide the analyst with an opportunity to specify the condition under which she would know that the theory was incorrect. Behavioralists then emphasize the two notions that theory should A. seek to explain something and B. be capable in principle of being tested against the world of observation. For behavioralists, non-falsible theories are not really theories at all. They are merely elaborate fantasies of varying degrees of complexity that scholar can choose to believe or disbelieve as they wish. For behavioralists, theory evaluation must proceed beyond merely examining a theory in order to assess its internal consistency and the nature of the puzzles that it seems to resolve. Theory evaluation must also involve subjecting theoretical propositions to empirical test. Criticism of the behavioral approach. As with any other general approach in the social science, behaviorism has been the target of a number of important criticisms. These criticisms can be grouped under three broad headings, and each will be examined in turn below. Objection of the positivity claim that statements which are neither definitions nor empirical are meaningless. It was noted earlier that behavioralism has its philosophical role in positivism. It would appear to follow that any weakness inherent in positivism must also therefore be inherent in behavioralism. Among the many criticisms that have been labeled as positivism, perhaps the most important is the simple proposition that the large class of statements that positivism label as meaningless is in fact contain many ideas that can add many significantly to our understanding of social behavior and the human condition. In strict positivist terms, there can be no role for normative theory for the investigation of what ought to be, because normative discourse are not restricted to definitional and empirical statement. Similarly, there can be no role of aesthetic and moral argument for the same reason. If positivism seems to exclude these forms of reflection, the argument runs it must be in error. The extent to which positivists generally even ever did deny the value of non-empirical analysis need not concern us here. It is important to point out, however, that most contemporary researchers who continue to work in the behavioralist tradition would almost certainly reject the notion that there can be no role for normative theory, aesthetic, or hermeneutical in political and social analysis. They would argue instead that these approaches yield a different form of knowledge or understanding, not that they are meaningless. In sense, modern behavioralism acknowledges freely this particular criticism of positivism. They deflect it from themselves by recognizing that other potential useful form of knowledge can be acquired by scholars working in their intellectual tradition. Moderate behavioralists, post behavioralists simply prefer to subject their own theoretical claim to empirical test. They also suspect that scholars working in non empirical tradition are never able to provide a satisfactory answer to the crucial question: how would you know if you were wrong? The tendency toward mindless empiricism. One of the claims of the early positives that theoretical understanding should be obtained only through a process of inquiry that begin with theory-free observation of all the facts up to now, and which then derived a law-like generalization inductively from the empirical and regularities that were observed. Later, positivists notable Karl Hampel and Popper strongly reject this narrow inductivist view at the nature of scientific inquiry, arguing that inquiry could only proceed if the researchers' effort to observe relevant facts were guided either by clear theoretical expectation or at the minimum by some kind of explanatory hunch. Hampel 1966 pp 11-12 is worth quoting at length in this context. In spite of positives move away from the inductivism, there can be no doubt that between the early 1950s and the mid 1970s, a number of scholars working within the behavioral traditional did still appear to be committed to the inductivist approach to research. It would be unnecessary invidious to isolate particular example of these tendency. It is none the less fair to say that during this period many behavioralists acted as if law-like scientific generalism could be constructed purely by identifying the statistical regularities evident in large quantity of empirical data. These emphasize on data and the concomitant downgrading of a prior theoretical reasoning in turn produced two undesirable tendencies in behavioral research. The first of these was the tendency to emphasize that can be easily measured rather than what might be theoretical important. This sort of criticism is always easy to make, in the sense that one person may be another profundity. Nonetheless, the tendency to play down the potential importance of phenomena that are intrinsically different to measure has always been a matter of concern to both critics and advocates of behavioral research. This has been especially true in relation to the analysis of electoral behavior. Since the explosion of behavioral research in the 1950s, voting studies have concentrated primarily on electro-social profile, partition, identification, ideological position, policy preferences, and economic perception. Complex models have been devised and tested empirically which show the relevant importance and causal ordering of different aspects of their various phenomena in the determination of the vote. See for example Sarlik and Crew 1983, Health AL 1985-1991. Yet, despite the considerable contribution that behavioral analysis had made to our understanding of a voter decision calculus, it has often been argued that somehow an important part of what it means to vote as well as part of the calculus itself may have been omitted from behavioral analysis. There has perhaps been insufficient attention paid to inconsistencies and contradictions in voter political perceptions and to the possibility not only the many voters change their political preferences frequently, but also that their preferences vary quite genuinely with the social context in which they are expressed. There are other areas related to the way in which individuals reflect to a greater or lesser degree among themselves, where behavioral electoral research has simply not dared to treat. What sort of person do I think I am? What aspirations and expectations do I have about my future life? What sort of life do I think I am capable of leading or should lead? How do I relate my notion of personal morality to the moral stances of the major political parties? The answer to questions such as these may have no bearing on the way in which political preferences are formed and transformed. Within the behavioral frame of references, however, it is very hard to envisage how the response of such questions, given the difficulty to measuring those responses systematically, could ever be incorporated into formal analysis. As a result, they are largely excluded from the analytic frame. A second and related undesirable feature of unbehavioral research that arises from its overly empirical focus has been a tendency to concentrate on readily observed phenomena such as voting rather than the more subtle and perhaps deeper structure forces that promote stability and changes in social and political system. One obvious concept that has been neglected by behavioral research in this context is that of interest. The notion of interest has played an important part in a wide variety of social and political theory ranging from Marx, Max Weber and Wilfred Pareto in the domestic field of Hans Morgenthau and E. H. Carr in the field of international relations. In all these contexts, social actor, whether they are individual, group of individual or even nation states, are seen as pursuing strategies that are aimed at maximizing their interest. In consequences, behavioral researcher has tended to shy away from the theoretical and empirical analysis of interest, preferring to leave the field clear for scholars working in other non-empirical traditional. The assumed independence of theory and observation. Next topic. The early behavioralists proclaimed their approach to social inquiry as being both scientific and value-free. They claim not to be seeking to justify any particular ethical or political stance. Rather, they sought simply to uncover the facts through empirical observation and to offer politically neutral theories that would explain them in the most pronounced way. As the passage from Hempel quoted earlier shows, the degree of inductivism that implied, in which explanatory theory emerged only after the relevant facts that have surveyed impartially, was always impossible. Some sort of initial theoretical understanding is necessary before the researcher that decide what is that should be observed. Modern behavioralists, along with researchers working in these intellectual traditions, roundly reject the notion that theory and observation are independent. On the contrary, most post-behavioralists would now accept the relativistic view that what is observed is a part of consequences of the theoretical position that our analytic adopt in the first place. Modern behavioralists, however, are distinguishable and hard-line relativist. It is one thing to allow that observation are colored by theory. It is quite another to conclude that this means one set of theories and observation are as good as another. For modern behavioralists, the ultimate test of a good theory is still whether or not inconsistent but observation with the available empirical evidence. Modern behavioralists are perfectly prepared to accept that different theoretical positions are like to allocate different description of reality, that they are likely to produce different observations. They insist, however, that whatever observations are implied by a particular theoretical perspective, those observations must be used in order to conduct a systematic empirical test of a theory that is being posted. Finally, it is worth noting that behavioralists are sometimes criticized with some justification for failing to comprehend the big picture of social and political transformation. This is to say, by emphasizing the description and explanation of observable individual and group behavior. Behavioralists underestimate the importance of more profound social and political changes that might be taking place. For example, theoretical who debate the way in which the state evolved under condition of advanced capitalism. For example, Adorno 1976, Habermas 1976, Jessop 1990 tend to deride behavioral analysis as being concerned merely with superficialities and with failing to offer a theory or explanation of significant social or political change. Behavioralists respond by pointing out that broad-ranging social theories that purport to analyze significant social change must be based on some sort of empirical observation. If a writer wishes to argue, for example, that the capitalist state is in crisis, then she must be able to specify what the observer relevant to the crisis of known or must be thinking certain things that enable the analysis to know that a crisis exists. Similarly, if some new form of social relationship is emerging, then the new form of relationship must have some empirical reference. Otherwise, how can the analysis know that the new form is needed occurring? Behavioralists are entirely prepared to recognize the broad-ranging social and political theories are both possible and desirable. They merely insist that if such theories are to be credible, they cannot be couched indefinitely at so high a level of abstraction as they render them incapable of being tested empirically. For behavioralism, social and political theories are supposed to describe and explain that which can be observed, whether it involves stats or change. Theory of social change only start to be interesting to behavioralists when they a. specify the empirical reference that are used in order to make the judgment that profound change is indeed taking place. B. Provide the empirical evidence which show that these references are indeed changing in the specified direction. Behavioralism is entirely neutral as to what the reference in any theory should be. This is the domain of the social theorist himself. To behavioralists, however, a social theory without clear empirical reference is nothing more than mere exertion. The strengths of the behavioral approach. While it is clear from the foregoing discussion that the behavioral approach can be subjected to serious criticism, it would be very wrong to infer that all examples of behavioral research are flawed. On the contrary, behavioral research at its best can make a considerable theoretical and empirical contribution to the understanding and explanation of social behavior. The need for clarity of expression in turn means the behavioral rarely enter into the most austere area of academic debate. What did writer X mean when she argued Y? For behavioralists, unless X make it clear what she means in the first place, then X work is clearly not capable of being replicated. An argument Y is therefore likely to be treated with suspicion in any case. The strength of good behavioral analysis can be illustrated by reference to Ted Gurr's classic study of the causes of political violence, or as he terms in Civil Strife, Gurr 1968a, 1968b. The core of Gurr's analysis is extraordinarily simple. His basic thesis, which draws strongly political violence because they are relatively depraved. This proposition can be expressed as a simple causal diagram. Relative deprivation, RD, civil strife, where civil strife involve participation in riot, act of guerrilla warfare, exonation and physical assault on political opponent. Relative deprivation, RD, is the gap between value expectations and perceived value capabilities. value expectation are the income, wealth, status, quality of life, and political right that individuals think they ought to obtain. And perceived value capabilities are the income, wealth, and so on that individual believe they will obtain. In GER terms, therefore, an individual is relatively deprived to the extent that there is a gap between his or her expectation and perceived capabilities. His basic hypothesis is that the greater will be his or her propensity to participate in violent political activity. A corollary is to this individual level proposition is that social aggregate, for example cities, region or countries characterized by high level of relative deprivation with experience higher level of civil strife than comparable social aggregate where RD is lower. Because GER analysis make theoretical statement about the relationship between RD and political violence at both the individual and the aggregate level, this thesis can in principle be tested at both of these levels. At the individual level, the test would involve examine information on a representative sample of people in one or more countries. The simple empirical question to be investigated would be, are the relative deprived individual also the one who engage in act of political violence? If this relationship held perfectively, it says 1,000 people had been interviewed finally similar to those shown in table 3.3 would be anticipated. At the aggregate level, the test would involve examining, say, empirical question would be, are the countries with high level of ID also the ones with experience high level of civil strife? Again, if the relationship held perfectly, empirical finding something like those shown in table 3.2 would be anticipated. Table 3.1, hypothetical cross tabulation of the individual level relationship between political violence and relative deprivation. Non-relative deprived, relative deprived. Non-political violent 950, political violent 0, total 950. Relative deprived, non-political violent 0, politically violent 50, total will be 50. Now total of all these, non-political violent 950, political violent 50 and subtotal will be 1000. Note, assume 1000 hypothetical individuals. Table 3.2, hypothetical cross tabulation of the aggregate level relationship between political violence and relative depreciation. First, countries with low relative depreciation. Column, country with low political violence 100, country with high political violence 0. So total will be 150. Sorry, 100. Countries with high relative depreciation 0, country with high political violence 50, total will be 50. Assume 150 hypothetical countries. Because of lack of suitable cross-national survey data for testing this thesis at the individual level, Gull opted to test out his idea at the aggregate level. To complicate matter, however, Gull recognized that there are likely to be other phenomena apart from RD, which might affect the level of civil strife experienced in different countries. These other phenomena also need to be incorporated into the empirical test of the model if the true effect of RD are to be estimated. Accordingly, as figure 3.1 shown, GER main model also seek to take account of the effect of the strength and durability of existing political institutional and legitimacy, the coercive potential of the state, and geographical and socio-political condition that might be conducive to the successful prosecution of guerrilla warfare, social structure facilitation, and each country experience of past strife. GER also distinguished between relative depreciation that result from recent changes in economy and or political condition and relative depreciation that derives from longer term deficiency on the basis of a set of theoretical argument that need not concern us here. Gur hypothesisly the causal ordering of effect to be as shown in figure 3.1. Figure 3.1 is basic theoretical model tested by Gur in his aggregate cross-national analysis of civil life. So first is persisting deprivation, then short-term deprivation, then institutionalism, then legitimacy, coercive potential, social structure, facilitation. Persistive depreciation is connected with magnitude of civil strife 1961 phase, and social structure, facilitation and institutionalism connected to past strife 1946-59. Before Gur can test his theoretical ideas, however, he is obliged to operationalize the model outlined in figure 3.1. Operationalization is the process of translating an abstract verbal theory into a form that can be rested empirically. In this case, Gur need to obtain a score of each of the 112 countries included in his analysis. Operationalization is necessary for the obvious reason that theories typically are couched in an abstract language that does not always correspond directly to the world of observation. For each concept that the model defined, a set of empirical referent or indicator is required. Each of these indicators need to be measured clearly or comparably scored for each concept. The specific indicator that Gur employ for each of the concepts shown in 3.1 are described in table 3.3. An important part of these theoretical analysis, which cannot be reviewed here because of its length, consisting in provided a set of, since the concept cannot themselves be directly measured, there is no formal empirical way of assessing the adequacy of these arguments. Under scholars simply have to make their own judgment as to how plausible each of them is. The strength of the argument that are advanced at this stage or any inquiry determine the adequacy of the particular operationalization that is provided. It is worth noting that almost all behavior studies can be criticized with varying degree of justification on the ground that our operational indicators selected do not effectively measure the theoretical concept to which they refer. Table 3.3. Main theoretical concept and empirical indicator employed in Gur's aggregate cross-national analysis of civil strife. Concept and then indicator operational measure. First, persisting deprivation. Economy. Percentage of population excluded from higher economic position. Political discrimination. Percentage of population excluded from the political elite. Potential separation. Percentage of population belonging to historical separate regional or ethnic groupings. Dependence on foreign capital. Percentage of GDP that occurs to foreign supplier of goods or capital. Lack of educational opportunity. Percentage of children not enrolled at primary or secondary school. Second, short-term deprivation. Short-term trade pattern. Whether or not the country trade volume increased 1957 to 60 compared with 1950 to 57. Inflation. Whether inflation increased or decreased from 1958 to 61 to 1960 to 30s. Growth rate. Whether GNP growth rate went up down in 1960-63 compared with 1950-60. New restrictions imposed on political participation. 6-point scale of repression government action, that is 1. Harassment of a party, 3rd. Banning of minor party, and 6. Dissolution of all parties. 3rd. Cohesive potential. Size of internal security force as a percentage of a population, whether by a loyalty score. 4. Institutionalization. composite of percentage of workforce, central government expenditure as a percentage of GDP, duration of existing party system. Fifth, legitimacy, composite of whether or not political institutions were derived individually, length of time since last major reform of domestic political institution. Sixth, social structural facilitation, composite of index of inaccessibility of terrain, degree of external support for insurgents, size of communist party. Seventh, magnitude of civil strife, composite index embracing incidents of demonstration, political strikes, riots, local rebellions, coups, plore, purges, widespread revolts 1960 to 65. To those unfamiliar with computer-based technique, the most difficult, indeed imperilable part of Girl's work is undoubtedly his statistical analysis. For the purpose of the present explanation, there is no need to dwell on his statistical manipulation. It is sufficient to note A. that Girl's main purpose is to establish how much of the country by country variation is level of civil strife can be explained by his measure of relative deprivation. B. that the multi-meter statistical methodology that he employ are well suited to this task. Girl conclude that approximately a quarter of cross-national variation in civil strife can be explained by varying level of relative deprivation, that some of the remaining variation can be explained by other variable included in his model, and just over a third of a variation remain unexplained. In other words, what Girl is able to show empirically is that there is some support of initial hypothesis about the role of deprivation in the genesis of political violence. At the same time, however, his analysis also shows that other factors, some of which he is unable to specify, also exert important effect on the level of political violence that different countries experience. If it seems a rather timid conclusion, then so be it. Girl began his study with a single, unicasual explanation of civil strife. He then specified an aggregate level model that enabled him to test his theoretical claim against the available empirical evidence. He concluded that the model derives some support from what is observed, that RD does indeed influence civil strife, but that there must be other factors at work which also cause people to resort to political violence. That is to say, his research involved a continuous interplay empirical observation, operationalization, and testing in which empirical findings are subsequently used to modify. Crucially, however, because Girl research follows behavioralist precepts, it is always possible for the dispassionate observer to know is using to sustainable his theoretical claim. In the often vague, and writers seem almost deliberately to deploy obfuscation as a mean of perspecting criticism. There are qualities to be cherished and nurtured. Girl analyze might be easy to criticize, particularly in terms of operational and good behaviors. Girl at least present a clear expressed target for would-be critics. For behaviorists, it is better to be clear and wrong than is to be impenetrable. Then other writers are obliged to debate the meaning of what has been written. Conclusion: the behavior legacy in the 1990s. Among behavioralists working in the mid-1990s, it is widely accepted that theoretical analysis must always be the starting point for serious empirical inquiry. This is not to say that theories cannot be modified, enhanced, or rejected on the basis of empirical observation. Rather, theory acts as a vehicle for distancing the analyst from the potential overwhelming detail of what can be directly observed, so that abstract deduction can be made about the connection between different phenomena. In addition, theory not only generate testable hypotheses but also provide guideline and signposts as to the sort of empirical evidence that should be gathered in the first place. In short, theory plays an indissoluble role in post-behavioral empirical analysis. Many post-behavioral would go even further that this the direction of epistemological relativism. It often used to be argued that there was an objective social reality out there in the world of observation waiting to be discovered by scientific analysis. This view is by